They were not railway children to begin with. They were just ordinary suburban children, and they lived with their father and mother in an ordinary red brick-fronted villa. There were 3 of them. Roberta was the eldest. Of course, mothers never have favourites, but if their mother had had a favourite, it might have been Roberta. Next came Peter, who wished to be an engineer when he grew up, and then the youngest was Phyllis, who meant extremely well. Mother did not spend all her time in paying dull calls to dull ladies. She was almost always there, ready to play with the children and read to them and help them to do their home lessons. Besides this, she used to write stories for them while they were at school and read them aloud after tea. These 3 lucky children always had everything they needed: pretty clothes, good fires, a lovely nursery with heaps of toys. You will think that they ought to have been very happy, and so they were. But they did not know how happy till the pretty life in Edgecomb Villa was over and done with, and they had to live a very different life indeed. The dreadful change came quite suddenly. Peter had a birthday, his 10th. Among his other presents was a model engine, more perfect than you could ever have dreamed of. Its charm lasted in its full perfection for exactly 3 days. Then, owing perhaps to Peter's inexperience, the engine suddenly went off with a bang. All the Noah's Ark people who were in the tender were broken to bits, but nothing else was hurt except the poor little engine and the feelings of Peter. All Peter's hopes for the curing of his afflicted engine were now fixed on his father, for father could mend all sorts of things. With heroic unselfishness, he didn't say anything till after father had had his dinner and his after-dinner cigar. Then he fetched what was left of the engine. Said father. The children held their breaths. Is there no hope? Said Peter. Hope? Rather, tons of it, said father, but it'll want something besides hope. A bit of brazing, say, or some solder and a new valve. I'll give up Saturday afternoon to it, and you shall all help me. Can girls help to mend engines? Peter asked. Of course they can. Girls are just as clever as boys, and don't you forget it. How would you like to be an engine driver, Phil? My face would be always dirty, wouldn't it? Said Phyllis, and I expect I should break something. I should just love it, said Roberta. Do you think I could when I'm grown up, Daddy? Or even a stoker? You mean a fireman? Well, if you still wish it when you're grown up, we'll see about making you a firewoman. I remember when I was a boy. Just then there was a knock at the front door. Who on earth? Said father. An Englishman's home is his castle, of course, but I do wish they built semi-detached villas with moats and drawbridges. Ruth, she was the parlour maid and had red hair, came in and said that 2 gentlemen wanted to see the master. I've shown them into the library, sir. I expect it's a subscription to the choir holiday fund, said Mother. Get rid of them quickly, dear. But Father did not seem to be able to get rid of the gentlemen at all quickly. Mother tried to make the time pass by telling them a new fairy story about a princess with green eyes, but it was difficult because they could hear the voices of Father and the gentleman in the library. Then the bell rang, and everyone heaved a breath of relief. They're going now, said Phyllis. He's rung to have them shown out. But instead of showing anybody out, Ruth showed herself in. Please 'em, she said. The master wants you to just step into the study. He looks like the dead, Mum. I think he's had bad news. Mother went into the library. There was more talking. Then the bell rang again, and Ruth fetched a cab. The children heard Boots go out and down the steps. The cab drove away, and the front door shut. Then Mother came in. Her dear face was as white as her lace collar. It's bedtime, she said. Ruth will put you to bed. But Father was going to tell us, began Phyllis. Father's been called away on business. Come, darlings, go at once. They kissed her and went. Roberta lingered to give Mother an extra hug and to whisper, It wasn't bad news, Mummy, was it? Is anyone dead? Or... Nobody's dead, no. She almost seemed to push Roberta away. I can't tell you anything tonight, my pet. Go, dear, go now. When the children came down to breakfast the next morning, Mother had already gone out. To London, Ruth said, and left them. Oh, there's something awful the matter, said Peter. Ruth told me last night we should know soon enough. Did you ask her? Said Roberta. Yes, I did, said Peter. If you could go to bed without caring whether Mother was worried or not, I couldn't, so there. Of course they had all cared terribly. It was nearly 7 before Mother came in that evening. She was looking ill and tired. Now, my darlings, I want to tell you something. Those men last night did bring very bad news, and Father will be away for some time. I want you not to ask me any questions about this trouble, and not to ask anybody else any questions. Peter shuffled his boots on the carpet. You'll promise this too, won't you? I did ask Ruth, said Peter suddenly. I'm very sorry, but I did. And what did she say? She said I should know soon enough. It isn't necessary for you to know anything about it, said Mother. It's about business, and you never do understand business, do you? No, said Roberta. Is it something to do with government? For Father was in a government office. Yes. Now it's bedtime, my darlings. Now don't you worry. It'll all come right in the end. Everything continued to be perfectly horrid for some weeks. Mother was nearly always out, and then she came down to breakfast one morning, very pale. She smiled as well as she could and said, Now, my pets, everything is settled. We're going to leave this house and go and live in the country. Oh, it's such a ducky, dear little white house. I know you'll love it. A whirling week of packing followed. Edgecomb Villa was like a furniture warehouse. I think the children enjoyed it very much. But we seem to be taking only the ugly things, said Roberta. We're taking the useful ones, said Mother. We've got to play at being poor for a bit, my chickabiddy. When all the ugly, useful things had been packed up and taken away in a van, boxes were filled and more boxes, and then, late in the afternoon, a cab came to take them to the station. At first they enjoyed looking out of the carriage windows, but when it grew dusk, they grew sleepier and sleepier, and no one knew how long they'd been in the train when they were roused by Mother saying, Wake up, dears, we're there. They stood shivering on the draughty platform while the baggage was taken out and put on the station cart. Then the engine, puffing and blowing, set to work again and dragged the train away. This was the first train the children saw on that railway. They didn't guess then how they would grow to love it and how soon it would become the center of their new life. Come, said Mother. We've got to walk. There aren't any cabs here. The walk was cold and dark and muddy. There were no gas lamps, and the road was uphill. The cart went at a slow pace, and they followed the gritty crunch of its wheels. As their eyes got used to the darkness, they could see the mound of boxes swaying dimly in front of them. A long gate had to be opened for the cart to pass through, and after that the road seemed to go across fields, and now it went downhill. Presently a great, dark, lumpish thing showed over to the right. There's the house, said Mother. I wonder why she shut the shutters. Who's she? Asked Roberta. The woman I engaged to clean the place and put the furniture straight and get supper. There was a low wall and trees inside. That's the garden. The cart went on along by the garden wall and round to the back of the house, and here it clattered into a cobblestoned yard and stopped at the back door. There was no light in any of the windows. Everyone hammered at the door, but no one came. The man who drove the cart said he expected Mrs. Viney had gone home. Your train was that late, you see. But she's got the key, said Mother. What are we to do? Oh, she'll have left that under the doorstep, said the cartman. Folks do hereabouts. Aye, here it is, right enough. He unlocked the door and went in and set his lantern on the table. Got a candle? I don't know where anything is. Mother spoke rather less cheerfully than usual. He struck a match, and there was a candle on the table, and he lighted it. The children saw a large, bare kitchen with a stone floor. There were no curtains, no hearthrug. The kitchen table from home stood in the middle of the room. The chairs were in one corner, crockery in another, and the black grate showed only cold, dead ashes. As the cartman turned to go after he'd brought in the boxes, there was a rustling, scampering sound that seemed to come from inside the walls of the house. Oh, what's that? Cried the girls. It's only the rats, said the cartman. He went away and shut the door, and the sudden draught of it blew out the candle. Oh, dear, said Phyllis, I wish we hadn't come. Only the rats, said Peter in the dark. Next morning, Roberta woke Phyllis by pulling her hair gently. Wake up. We're in the new house, don't you remember? No servants or anything. Let's creep down mouse quietly and have everything beautiful before Mother gets up. I've woken Peter. He'll be dressed as soon as we are. Of course, there was no water in their room, so when they got down, they washed as much as they thought was necessary under the spout of the pump in the yard. One pumped and the other washed. "Oh, it's much more fun than basin washing," said Roberta. "How sparkly the weeds are between the stones, and the moss on the roof. Oh, and the flowers." The roof of the back kitchen was made of thatch, and it had moss on it, and house leeks, and stonecrop, and wallflowers, and even a clump of purple flag flowers. "This is far, far and away prettier than Edgecomb Villa," said Phyllis. "I wonder what the garden's like." "We mustn't think of the garden yet," said Roberta. "Let's go in and begin to work." They lighted the fire and put the kettle on and arranged the crockery for breakfast. When there seemed to be nothing more that they could do, they went out again into the fresh, bright morning. It was a hilly country. Down below they could see the line of the railway and the black, yawning mouth of a tunnel. The station was out of sight. There was a great bridge with tall arches running across one end of the valley. "Let's go down and look at the railway," said Peter. "There might be trains passing." "We can see them from here," said Roberta. "Let's sit down a bit." So they all sat down on a great flat grey stone that had pushed itself up out of the grass, and when Mother came out to look for them at 8 o'clock, she found them deeply asleep in a contented, sun-warmed bunch. They'd made an excellent fire and had set the kettle on it at about 5:30, so that by 8 the fire had been out for some time. The water had all boiled away and the bottom was burnt out of the kettle. The day passed in helping Mother to unpack and arrange things. 6 small legs quite ached with running about while their owners carried clothes and crockery and all sorts of things to their proper places. It was not till quite late in the afternoon that Mother said, "There, that'll do for today. I'll lie down for an hour so as to be fresh as a lark by supper time." Then they all looked at each other. Each of the 3 faces expressed the same thought. Where shall we go? To the railway. The way was all downhill over the smooth, short turf, with here and there furze bushes and grey and yellow rocks sticking out like candied peel from the top of a cake. The way ended in a steep run and a wooden fence, and there was the railway, with the shining metals and the telegraph wires and posts and signals. They all climbed onto the top of the fence, and then suddenly there was a rumbling sound that made them look along the line to the right, where the dark mouth of a tunnel opened itself in the face of a rocky cliff. Next moment, a train had rushed out of the tunnel with a shriek and a snort, and had slid noisily past them. "Oh," said Roberta, "it was like a great dragon tearing by. Did you feel it fan us with its hot wings?" "I suppose a dragon's lair might look very like that tunnel from the outside," said Phyllis. But Peter said, "I never thought we should ever get so near to a train as this. It's the most ripping sport." "Better than toy engines, isn't it?" said Roberta. "I don't know. It's different," said Peter. "You know, I'm tired of calling Roberta by her name. I don't see why I should. No one else does. Everyone else calls her Bobby, and I don't see why I shouldn't." "I wonder if that train was going to London," Bobby said. "London's where Father is." "Let's go down to the station and find out," said Peter. So they went. They walked along the edge of the line and heard the telegraph wires humming over their heads. Soon they passed close to a signal box, close enough to be able to notice the wires and to hear the mysterious ping-ping, followed by the strong, firm clicking of the machinery. They arrived at the station, not through the booking office, but in a freebooting sort of way by the sloping end of the platform. This in itself was joy. Joy, too, it was to peep into the porter's room where the lamps are and one porter half asleep behind a paper. There were a great many crossing lines at the station. Some of them just ran into a yard. Trucks stood on the rails here, and on one side was a great heap of coal. Not a loose heap, but a sort of solid building of coals, with large square blocks of coal outside, used just as though they were bricks. There was a line of whitewash near the top of the coaly wall. When presently the porter lounged out of his room, Peter said, "How do you do?" in his best manner, and hastened to ask what the white mark on the coal was for. "To mark how much coal there be," said the porter. so we'll know if anyone nicks it. So don't you go off with none in your pockets, young gentleman." This seemed at the time but a merry jest, but Peter felt at once that the porter was a friendly sort with no nonsense about him. But later the words came back to Peter with a new meaning. The sorrow the children had felt at Father's going away and at Mother's being so unhappy made a deep impression, but the impression didn't last long. They soon got used to being without Father, though they didn't forget him, and they got used to not going to school and to seeing very little of Mother, who was now almost all day shut up in her upstairs room, writing. She used to come down at tea time and read aloud the stories she'd written. They were lovely stories. The rocks and hills and valley and trees, the canal, and above all the railway, were so new and so perfectly pleasing that the remembrance of the old life in the villa grew to seem almost like a dream. Mother had told them more than once that they were quite poor now, but this didn't seem to be anything but a way of speaking. There was always enough to eat, and they wore the same clothes they'd always worn. But in June came 3 wet days, and it was very, very cold. Nobody could go out, and everybody shivered. They all went up to the door of Mother's room and knocked. "Well, what is it?" asked Mother from inside. "Mother," said Bobby, "mayn't I light a fire? I do know how." And Mother said, "No, my ducky love, we mustn't have fires in June. Coal is so dear. If you're cold, go and have a good romp in the attic. That'll warm you." Later, at tea time, when Phyllis was going to add jam to her bread and butter, Mother said, "Jam or butter, dear. Not jam and butter. We can't afford that sort of reckless luxury nowadays." After tea, when they were back in the attic, Peter said to his sisters, "I have an idea." "What's that?" they asked politely. "I shan't tell you," was Peter's unexpected rejoinder. "I'm going to do a lone adventure. Some people might think it wrong. I don't. But if Mother asks where I am, say I'm playing at mines." "What sort of mines?" "You just say mines." "You might tell us, Pete." "Well, then, coal mines. But don't you let that word pass your lips on pain of torture." "You needn't threaten," said Bobby, "and I do think you might let us help. If I find a coal mine, you shall help cart the coal." 2 nights after the dawning of Peter's idea, he beckoned the girls mysteriously at the twilight hour. "Come hither with me," he said, "and bring the Roman chariot." The Roman chariot was a very old perambulator that had spent years of retirement in the loft over the coach-house. "Follow your dauntless leader," said Peter, and led the way down the hill towards the station. Just above the station, in a little hollow between 3 rocks, lay a heap of dried brambles and heather. Peter turned over the brushwood with his boot. "Here's the first coal from the St. Peter's mine. We'll take it home in the chariot. All orders carefully attended to, any shaped lump cut to suit regular customers." The chariot was packed full of coal, but 3 journeys had to be made before the coal from Peter's mine was added to the heap of Mother's coal in the cellar. Afterwards, Peter went out alone and came back very black and mysterious. "I've been to the coal mine," he said. "Tomorrow evening we'll bring back the black diamonds in the chariot." It was a week later that Mrs. Viney, who came to clean for them, remarked to Mother how well this last lot of coal was holding out. The children hugged themselves in silent laughter. They'd all forgotten by now that there had ever been any doubt in Peter's mind as to whether coal mining was wrong. But there came a dreadful night when the station-master crept out very quietly to the yard where the heap of coal was and waited like a cat by a mouse-hole. On the top of the heap, something small and dark was scrabbling and rattling furtively. It came to the edge of the heap, cautiously let itself down and lifted something after it. Then the arm of the station-master was raised, and there was Peter, firmly held by the collar of his jacket, with an old carpenter's bag full of coal in his trembling clutch. "So I've caught you at last, have I, you young thief?" said the station-master. "I'm not a thief, I'm a coal miner." "Tell that to the Marines," said the station-master. "It would be just as true whoever I told it to," said Peter. "You're right there. Stow your jaw, you young rip, and come along to the station." "Oh, no," cried a voice that was not Peter's. "Not the police station," said another voice from the darkness. "Not yet," said the station-master. "The railway station first." "Why, it's a regular gang. Any more of you?" "Only us," said Bobby and Phyllis, coming out of the shadows. The station master struck a match and looked at them by its flickering light. "Why, you're the children from the 3 Chimneys up yonder. So nicely dressed, too. Tell me now, what made you do such a thing? Don't you know it's wicked to steal?" "I didn't think it was stealing," said Peter. "I thought if I took it from the outside part of the heap, perhaps it would be, but in the middle I thought I could fairly count it only mining." "Oh, did you? Did you do it for a lark or what?" "Not much of a lark carrying that stuff up the hill." "Then why did you?" The station-master's voice was so much kinder now that Peter replied, "You know that wet day? Well, Mother said we were too poor to have a fire. We always had fires when it was cold at our other house, and—" "Don't," interrupted Bobby. The station-master rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll look over it this once. But you remember, young gentleman, stealing is stealing, and what's mine isn't yours, whether you call it mining or whether you don't. Run along home." "Do you mean you aren't going to do anything to us?" "Well, you are a brick," said Peter. "You're a dear," said Bobby. "You're a darling," said Phyllis. "That's all right," said the station-master. And on this they parted. "There's an awful lot of coal in the cellar anyhow," said Peter as they climbed the hill. "Oh, don't," said Bobby. "I don't think we ought to be glad about that." "I don't know. I'm not at all sure even now that mining is a crime." But the girls were quite sure, and they were also quite sure that he was quite sure, however little he cared to own it. All their lives the children had lived in a street where cabs and omnibuses rumbled by at all hours. Here, in the deep silence of the sleeping country, the only things that went by were the trains. They seemed to be all that was left to link the children to the old life that had once been theirs. They began to know the hours when certain trains passed, and they gave names to them. The 9:15 up, for instance, was called the Green Dragon. It was by the Green Dragon that the old gentleman travelled. He was a very nice-looking old gentleman, and he looked as if he were nice too, which is not at all the same thing. He had a fresh-coloured, clean-shaven face, white hair, and he wore rather odd-shaped collars, and a top hat that wasn't exactly the same kind as other people's. Of course, the children didn't see all this at first. In fact, the first thing they noticed about the old gentleman was his hand. It was one morning as they sat on the fence waiting for the Green Dragon, which was 3¼ minutes late by Peter's watch. "The Green Dragon's going where Father is," said Phyllis. "If it was a real dragon, we could stop it and ask it to take our love to Father." "Dragons don't carry people's love," said Peter. "They'd be above it." "Yes, they do, if you tame them thoroughly first. They fetch and carry like pet spaniels. I wonder why Father never writes to us." "Mother says he's been too busy," said Bobby. "But he'll write soon, she says." "I say," Phyllis suggested, "let's all wave to the Green Dragon as it goes by. If it's a magic dragon, it'll understand and take our loves to Father." So when the Green Dragon tore shrieking out of the mouth of its dark lair, which was the tunnel, all 3 children stood on the railing and waved their pocket handkerchiefs. And out of a first-class carriage, a hand waved back. It was the old gentleman's hand. After this, it became the custom for waves to be exchanged between the children and the 9:15, and the children, especially the girls, liked to think that perhaps the old gentleman knew Father and would meet him in business and tell him how his 3 children stood on a rail far away in the green country and waved their love to him every morning, wet or fine. Mother all this time was very busy with her writing. She used to send off a good many long blue envelopes with stories in them, and envelopes of different sizes used to come to her. Sometimes she would sigh when she opened them and say, "Another story come home to roost, oh dear," and then the children would be very sorry. But sometimes she would wave the envelope in the air and say, "Hooray, hooray, here's a sensible editor. He's taken my story." Whenever an editor was sensible, there were buns for tea. One day Peter was going down to the village to get buns to celebrate the sensibleness of an editor when he met the station-master. Peter felt very uncomfortable, for he'd now had time to think over the affair of the coal mine. Stolen is a nasty word, but Peter felt it was the right one. So he looked down and said nothing. It was the station-master who said, "Good morning. Where are you off to in such a hurry?" he added. "I'm going to buy buns for tea," said Peter. "I thought you were all so poor." "Oh, so we are, but we always have 3 pennyworth of halfpennies for tea whenever Mother sells a story or a poem or anything." Oh, so your mother writes stories, does she? The beautifulest you ever read. You ought to be very proud to have such a clever mother. Yes, said Peter. Well, I must be getting along. You give us a look in at the station whenever you feel so inclined. And as to the coals... Oh, I'm very sorry, said Peter. Well, we'll let bygones be bygones, eh? Oh, thank you very much, said Peter. I'm so glad it's straightened out between us. The next day, when they'd sent the threefold wave of greeting to Father by the Green Dragon, and the old gentleman had waved back as usual, Peter proudly led the way to the station. There they spent a joyous 2 hours with the porter. He was a worthy man and seemed never tired of answering the questions that began with why. He told them, for instance, that the things that hook carriages together are called couplings, and that the pipes, like great serpents that hang over the couplings, are meant to stop the train with. If you could get a hold of one of them when the train is going and pull 'em apart, he said, she'd stop dead off with a jerk. Who's she? Said Phyllis. The train, of course, said the porter. After that, the train was never again it to the children. And you know the thing in the carriages where it say on it, £5 fine for improper use? If you was to improperly use that, the train'd stop. And if you used it properly, said Roberta, it'd just stop just the same, I suppose, said he. But it isn't proper use unless you're being murdered. In such delightful conversation, the time went by all too quickly. The stationmaster came out once or twice from that sacred inner temple, behind the place where the hole is that they sell you the tickets through, and was most jolly with them all. Just as if the coal had never been discovered, Phyllis whispered to her sister. He gave them each an orange, and promised to take them up into the signal box one of these days when he wasn't too busy. Several trains went through the station, and Peter noticed for the first time that engines have numbers on them like cabs. Yes, said the porter, I knowed a young gent as used to take down the numbers of every single one he seed. In a green notebook with silver corners it was, owing to his father being very well-to-do in the wholesale stationery. Peter did not happen to have a green leather notebook with silver corners, so the porter gave him a yellow envelope, and on it he noted 379663, and felt that this was the beginning of what would be a most interesting collection. It was the very next day that Mother had to stay in bed because her head ached so. Her hands were burning hot, and she wouldn't eat anything, and her throat was very sore. If I was you, Mum, said Mrs. Viney, I should take and send for the doctor. There's a lot of catchy complaints are going about just now. Mother wouldn't at first, but in the evening she felt so much worse that Peter was sent to the house in the village that had a brass plate with W.W. Forrest M.D. on it. W.W. Forrest M.D. came at once. He talked to Peter on the way back. He seemed a most charming and sensible man, interested in railways and rabbits and really important things. When he'd seen Mother, he said it was influenza. Now, Lady Graveairs, he said in the hall to Bobby, I suppose you'll want to be head nurse. Oh, of course, said she. Well, then, I'll send down some medicine. Keep up a good fire. Have some strong beef tea made ready to give her as soon as the fever goes down. She can have grapes now and beef essence and soda water and milk, and you better get in a bottle of brandy, the best brandy. She asked him to write it all down, and he did. When Bobby showed Mother the list, she laughed. It was a laugh, Bobby decided, though it was cold and feeble. Oh, nonsense, said Mother, lying in bed with eyes as bright as beads. I can't afford all that rubbish. Tell Mrs. Viney to boil 2 pounds of scrag end of the neck for your dinners tomorrow, and I can have some of the broth. Yes, I should like some more water now, love, and will you get a basin and sponge my hands? Roberta obeyed. When she'd done everything she could to make Mother less uncomfortable, she went down to the others. And now, said she, when she'd told all, there's no one but us to do anything, and we've got to do it. But even if we never have anything to eat at all, said Phyllis, you can't get all those other things with our dinner money. No, said Peter, frowning, we must find out some other way. Now think, everybody, just as hard as you can. They did think, and presently they talked. And later, when Bobby'd gone up to sit with Mother in case she wanted anything, the other two were very busy with scissors and a white sheet, and a paintbrush, and the pot of Brunswick black that Mrs. Viney used for grates and fenders. When the 9:15 came out of the tunnel the next morning, the old gentleman in the first-class carriage put down his newspaper and got ready to wave his hand to the 3 children on the fence. But this morning there were not 3. There was only 1, and that was Peter. Peter was not on the railings either, as usual. He was standing in front of them, pointing to a large white sheet nailed against the fence. On the sheet there were thick black letters more than a foot long, which read, "Look out at the station." A good many people did look out at the station and were disappointed, for they saw nothing unusual. The old gentleman looked out too, and at first he too saw nothing unusual. It was only just as the train was beginning to puff and pull itself together to start again that he saw Phyllis. She was quite out of breath with running. Oh, I thought I'd missed you. My bootlaces would keep coming undone, and I fell over them twice. Here, take it." She threw a letter into his hand as the train moved. He opened the letter, and this is what he read. "Dear Mr. We do not know your name. Mother is ill, and the doctor says to give her the things at the end of the letter, but she says she can't afford it, and to get mutton for us, and she will have the broth. We do not know anybody here but you, because Father is away, and we do not know the address. Father will pay you, or if he's lost all his money or anything, Peter will pay you when he's a man. We promise it on our honor. I owe you for all the things that Mother wants. Signed, Peter. Will you give the parcel to the stationmaster because of us not knowing what train you come down by? Say it is for Peter, who was sorry about the colds, and he will know all right. Roberta, Phyllis, Peter." Then came the list of things the doctor had ordered. The old gentleman read it through once, and his eyebrows went up. He read it twice and smiled a little. Then he put it in his pocket and went on reading the Times. At about 6 that evening there was a knock at the back door. The 3 children rushed to open it, and there stood the friendly porter. He dumped down a big hamper on the kitchen flags. "Old gent," he said. "He asked me to fetch it up straight away. I'm sorry your mamma isn't so well, and I've fetched her along a bit of sweet briar. Very sweet to smell it is." "Oh, thank you very much," said Peter. When the children undid the hamper, they found all the things they'd asked for, and then a good many things they'd not asked for. Peaches and port wine, and 2 chickens, a cardboard box of big red roses, a bottle of lavender water, and 3 fatter bottles of eau de cologne. There was a letter, too. "Dear Roberta and Phyllis and Peter," it said, "here are the things you want. Your mother will want to know where they came from. Tell her they were sent by a friend who heard she was ill. When she's well again, you must tell her all about it, of course. And if she says you ought not to have asked for the things, tell her that I say you were quite right, and that I hope she will forgive me for taking the liberty of allowing myself a great pleasure." The letter was signed G.P. something that the children couldn't read. "I think we were right," said Phyllis. "Right? Of course we were right," said Bobby. "All the same," said Peter, "I don't look forward exactly to telling Mother the whole truth about it." "We're not to do it till she's well," said Bobby. "Oh, just look at the roses. I must take them up to her." "And the sweet briar," said Phyllis. "Don't forget the sweet briar." "As if I should." About a fortnight after the arrival of the wonderful hamper, a second sheet was displayed to the Green Dragon from the railings, bearing the legend, "She is nearly well, thank you." The old gentleman saw it and waved a cheerful response from the train. And when this had been done, the children saw that now was the time when they must tell Mother what they'd done when she was ill. Mother was angrier than they had ever known her. This was horrible, but it was much worse when she suddenly began to cry. Crying is catching, I believe, like measles. At any rate, the children found themselves crying too. Mother stopped first. She dried her eyes, and then she said, "I'm sorry I was so angry, darlings, because I know you didn't understand." "We didn't mean to be naughty, Mummy," sobbed Bobby, and Peter and Phyllis sniffed. "Now listen," said Mother, "it's quite true that we're poor, but we have enough to live on. You mustn't go telling everyone about our affairs. It's not right. And you must never, never, never ask strangers to give you things. Now always remember that, won't you?" They all hugged her and rubbed their damp cheeks against hers and promised that they would. "And I'll write a letter to your old gentleman, and I shall tell him that I didn't approve. Oh, of course I shall thank him, too, for his kindness. It's you I don't approve of, my darlings, not the old gentleman. He was as kind as ever he could be, and you can give the letter to the stationmaster to give him, and he won't say any more about it. They took the letter down to the stationmaster. "I thought you said you hadn't got any friends except in London," said he. "We've made him since," said Peter. "But he doesn't live hereabouts?" "No, we just know him on the railway." Then the stationmaster retired to that sacred inner temple behind the little window where the tickets are sold, and the children went down to the porter's room. They learned several interesting things from the porter, among others that his name was Perks, that he was married, he had 3 children, and that the lamps in front of the engines are called headlights and the ones at the back tail lights. "And that just shows," whispered Phyllis, "that trains really are dragons in disguise with proper heads and tails." Then they told Perks how they'd named the 9:15 up the Green Dragon. "We call her the Snail among ourselves," said the porter. "She's more often late than any train on the line." "But the engine's green," said Phyllis. "Yes, miss, so's a snail some seasons of the year." The children agreed as they went home to dinner that Perks was most delightful company. Next day was Roberta's birthday. In the afternoon she was politely but firmly requested to get out of the way and keep there till tea time. "You aren't going to see what we're going to do till it's done. It's a glorious surprise," said Phyllis. And Roberta went out into the garden all alone. She tried to be grateful, but she felt she would much rather have helped in whatever it was than have to spend the birthday afternoon by herself, no matter how glorious the surprise might be. Now that she was alone, she had time to think. And one of the things she thought of most was what Mother had said in one of those feverish nights when her hands were so hot and her eyes so bright. The words were, "Oh, what a doctor's bill there'll be for all this." She walked round and round the garden among the rose bushes that hadn't any roses yet, only buds, and the lilac bushes and syringas and American currants, and the more she thought of the doctor's bill, the less she liked the thought of it. And presently she made up her mind. She went out through the side door of the garden and climbed up the steep field to where the road runs along by the canal. She walked along until she came to the bridge that crosses the canal and leads to the village, and here she waited. It was very pleasant in the sunshine to lean one's elbow on the warm stone of the bridge and look down at the blue water of the canal. Bobby'd never seen any other canal, except the Regent's Canal, and the water of that is not at all a pretty colour. And she'd never seen any river at all except the Thames, which also would be all the better if its face was washed. Perhaps the children would have loved the canal as much as the railway, but for 2 things. One was that they had found the railway first, on that first wonderful morning when the house and the country and the moors and rocks and great hills were all new to them. They'd not found the canal till some days later. The other reason was that everyone on the railway had been kind to them, the station-master, the porter, and the old gentleman who waved. Presently, as Bobby waited on the bridge, there was a sound of wheels, which was just what she expected. The wheels were the wheels of the doctor's dog-cart, and in the cart, of course, was the doctor. He pulled up and called out, "Hello, head nurse, want a lift?" "I wanted to see you," said Bobby. "Your mother's not worse, I hope." "No, but—" "Well, step in then and we'll go for a drive." Roberta climbed in and the brown horse was made to turn round, which it didn't like at all, for it was looking forward to its tea. I mean its oats. "Oh, this is jolly," said Bobby as the dog-cart flew along the road by the canal. "We could throw a stone down any one of your 3 chimneys," said the doctor, as they passed the house. "Yes, but you'd have to be a jolly good shot." "How do you know I'm not?" "Now then, what's the trouble?" Bobby fidgeted with the hook of the driving apron. "Come on, out with it." "It's rather hard, you see, to out with it because of what Mother said." "What did Mother say?" "She said I wasn't to go telling everyone that we're poor, but you aren't everyone, are you?" "Not at all. Well?" "Well, I know doctors are very extravagant. I mean expensive, and Mrs. Viney told me that her doctoring only cost her 2pence a week because she belonged to a club." "Yes?" "You see, she told me what a good doctor you were, and I asked her how she could afford you, because she's much poorer than we are. I've been to her house, and I know. And then she told me about the club, and I thought I'd ask you, and... Oh, I don't want Mother to be worried. Can't we be in the club too, the same as Mrs. Viney?" The doctor was silent. He was rather poor himself, and he'd been pleased at getting a new family to attend, so I think his feelings at that minute were rather mixed. You aren't cross with me, are you?" The doctor roused himself. "Cross, how could I be? You're a very sensible little woman. Now look here, don't you worry. I'll make it all right with your mother, even if I have to make a special, brand-new club all for her. Look here, this is where the aqueduct begins." "What's What's its name?" "A water bridge, look." The road rose to a bridge over the canal. To the left was a steep, rocky cliff with trees and shrubs growing in the cracks of the rock. And the canal here left off running along the top of the hill and started to run on a bridge of its own. A great bridge with tall arches that went right across the valley. Bobby drew a long breath. "It is grand, isn't it? It's like pictures in the history of Rome." "Right, that's just exactly what it is like. The Romans were dead nuts on aqueducts. It's a splendid piece of engineering." "I thought engineering was making engines." "Ah, there are different sorts of engineering. Making roads and bridges and tunnels is one kind, then making fortifications is another. Well, we must be turning back. And remember, you aren't to worry about doctor's bills, or you'll be ill yourself, and then I'll send you a bill as long as the aqueduct." When Bobby had parted from the doctor at the top of the field that ran down from the road to Three Chimneys, she could not feel that she'd done wrong. She knew that Mother would perhaps think differently, but Bobby felt that for once she was the one who was right, and she scrambled down the rocky slope with a really happy feeling. Phyllis and Peter met her at the back door. They were unnaturally clean and neat, and Phyllis had a red bow in her hair. There was only just time for Bobby to make herself tidy and tie up her hair with a blue bow before a little bell rang. "There," said Phyllis. "That's to show the surprise is ready. Now you wait till the bell rings again, and then you may come into the dining room." So Bobby waited. "Tinkle, tinkle," said the little bell, and Bobby went into the dining room feeling rather shy. Directly she opened the door, she found herself, as it seemed, in a new world of light and flowers and singing. Mother and Peter and Phyllis were standing in a row at the end of the table. The shutters were shut, and there were 12 candles on the table, one for each of Roberta's years. The table was covered with a sort of pattern of flowers, and at Roberta's place was a thick wreath of forget-me-nots and several most interesting little packages. And Mother and Phyllis and Peter were singing to the first part of the tune of St. Patrick's Day. Roberta knew that Mother had written the words on purpose for her birthday. It was a little way of mothers on birthdays. The song went like this. "Our darling Roberta, no sorrow shall hurt her, if we can prevent it her whole life long. Her birthday's our fete day, we'll make it our great day, and give her our presents and sing her our song. May pleasures attend her, and may the fates send her the happiest journey along her life's way, with skies bright above her and dear ones to love her. Dear Bob, many happy returns of the day." When they'd finished singing, they cried, "3 cheers for our Bobby," and gave them very loudly. Bobby felt exactly as though she were going to cry. You know that odd feeling in the bridge of your nose and the pricking in your eyelids. But before she had time to begin, they were all kissing and hugging her. "Now," said Mother, "look at your presents." They were very nice presents. There was a green and red needlebook that Phyllis had made herself in secret moments. There was a darling little silver brooch of Mother's shaped like a buttercup, which Bobby had known and loved for years, but which she'd never thought would come to be her own. There was also a pair of blue glass vases from Mrs. Viney. Roberta had seen and admired them in the village shop. And there were 3 birthday cards with pretty pictures and wishes. Mother fitted the forget-me-not crown on Bobby's brown head. "And now look at the table," she said. There was a cake on the table, covered with white sugar, with "Dear Bobby" on it in pink sweets, and there were buns and jam. But the nicest thing was that the big table was almost covered with flowers. Wallflowers were laid all around the tea tray. There was a ring of forget-me-nots round each plate. The cake had a wreath of white lilac round it, and in the middle was something that looked like a pattern all done with single blooms of lilac or wallflower or laburnum. "What is it?" asked Roberta. "It's a map of the railway," cried Peter. "Look, those lilac lines are the metals, and there's the station done in brown wallflowers. The laburnum is the train, and there are the signal boxes and the road up to here, and those fat red daisies are us 3 waving to the old gentleman. That's him, the pansy in the laburnum train. "And there's 3 chimneys done in the purple primroses," said Phyllis, "and that little tiny rosebud is Mother looking for us when we're late for tea. Peter invented it all, and we got all the flowers from the station. We thought you'd like it better." "That's my present," said Peter, suddenly dumping down his adored steam engine on the table in front of her. Its tender had been lined with fresh white paper and was full of sweets. Oh, Peter! Bobby was quite overcome by this munificence. "Not your own dear little engine that you're so fond of." "Oh, not the engine, only the sweets." Bobby couldn't help her face changing a little, not so much because she was disappointed at not getting the engine as because she had thought it so very noble of Peter, and now she felt that she'd been silly to think it. Also, she felt she must have seemed greedy to expect the engine as well as the sweets. So her face changed. Peter saw it. He hesitated a minute, then his face changed too, and he said, "I mean not all the engine. I'll let you go halves if you like." "You're a brick," cried Bobby. "It's a splendid present." She said no more aloud, but to herself she said, "That was awfully decent of Peter, because I know he didn't mean to. Well, the broken half shall be my half of the engine, and I'll get it mended and give it back to Pete for his birthday." "Yes, Mother dear, I should like to cut the cake," she added, and tea began. It was a delightful birthday. After tea, Mother played games with them, any game they liked, and of course their first choice was Blind Man's Buff, in the course of which Bobby's forget-me-not wreath twisted itself crookedly over one of her ears and stayed there. Then, when it was near bedtime and time to calm down, Mother had a lovely new story to read to them. "You won't sit up late working, will you, Mother?" Bobby asked as they said good night. And Mother said no, she wouldn't. She would only just write to Father and then go to bed. But when Bobby crept down later to bring up her presents, for she felt she really could not be separated from them all night, Mother was not writing, but leaning her head on her arms and her arms on the table. I think it was rather good of Bobby to slip quietly away, saying over and over, "She doesn't want me to know she's unhappy, and I won't know, I won't know." But it made a sad end to the birthday. The very next morning, Bobby began to watch her opportunity to get Peter's engine mended secretly, and the opportunity came the very next afternoon. Mother went by train to the nearest town to do shopping. When she went there, she always went to the post office, perhaps to post her letters to Father, for she never gave them to the children or Mrs. Viney to post, and she never went to the village herself. Peter and Phyllis went with her. Bobby wanted an excuse not to go, but try as she would, she couldn't think of a good one. And just when she felt that all was lost, her frock caught on a big nail by the kitchen door, and there was a great criss-cross tear all along the front of the skirt. I assure you this was really an accident. So the others pitied her and went without her, for there was no time for her to change, because they were rather late already and had to hurry to the station to catch the train. When they'd gone, Bobby put on her everyday frock and went down to the railway. She did not go into the station, but she went along the line to the end of the platform, where the engine is when the down train is alongside the platform, the place where there is a water tank and a long, limp leather hose like an elephant's trunk. She hid behind a bush on the side of the railway. She had the toy engine done up in brown paper, and she waited patiently with it under her arm. Then, when the next train came in and stopped, Bobby went across and stood beside the engine. She'd never been so close to an engine before. It looked much larger and harder than she'd expected, and it made her feel very small indeed, and somehow very soft, as if she could very, very easily be hurt rather badly. "I know what silkworms feel like now," said Bobby to herself. The engine driver and fireman did not see her. They were leaning out of the other side, telling the porter a tale about a dog and a leg of mutton. "If you please," said Roberta, but the engine was blowing off steam and no one heard her. "If you please, Mr. Engineer," she spoke a little louder, but the engine happened to speak at the same moment, and of course Roberta's little soft voice hadn't a chance. It seemed to her that the only way would be to climb onto the engine and pull at their coats. The step was high, but she got her knee on it and clambered onto the cab. She stumbled and fell on hands and knees on the base of the great heap of coals that led up to the square opening in the tender. The engine was not above the weaknesses of its fellows. It was making a great deal more noise than there was the slightest need for. And just as Roberta fell on the coals, the engine driver, who had turned without seeing her, started the engine, and when Bobby had picked herself up, The train was moving, not fast, but much too fast for her to get off. All sorts of dreadful thoughts came to her all together in one horrible flash. There were such things as express trains, which went on, she supposed, for hundreds of miles without stopping. Suppose this should be one of them. How would she get home again? She had no money to pay for the return journey. And I've no business here. I'm an engine burglar, that's what I am, she thought. I shouldn't wonder if they could lock me up for this. And the train was going faster and faster. There was something in her throat that made it impossible for her to speak. She tried twice. The men had their backs to her. They were doing something to things that looked like taps. Suddenly she put out her hand and caught hold of the nearest sleeve. The man turned with a start, and he and Roberta stood for a minute looking at each other in silence. Then the silence was broken by them both. The man said, "Here's a blooming go," and Roberta burst into tears. The other man said he was blooming well blessed, or something like it, but though naturally surprised, they were not exactly unkind. "You're a naughty little girl, that's what you are," said the fireman. But the engine driver said, "Darling little piece, I call her." But they made her sit down on an iron seat in the cab and told her to stop crying and tell them what she'd meant by it. She did stop as soon as she could. One thing that helped her was the thought that Peter would give almost his ears to be in her place on a real engine rarely going. The children had often wondered whether any engine driver could be found noble enough to take them for a ride on an engine, and now here she was. She dried her eyes and sniffed earnestly. "Now then," said the fireman, "out with it. What do you mean by it, eh?" "Oh, please," sniffed Bobby and stopped. "Try again," said the engine driver. Bobby tried again. "Please, Mr. Engineer, I did call out to you from the line, but you didn't hear me, and I just climbed up to touch you on the arm, quite gently I meant to do it, and then I fell into the coals, and I am so sorry if I frightened you. Oh, don't be cross, oh, please don't." She sniffed again. "We ain't so much cross," said the fireman, "as interested like. It ain't every day a little girl tumbles into our coal bunker out of the sky, is it, Bill? What did you do it for, eh?" "That's the point," agreed the engine driver. "What did you do it for?" Bobby found that she'd not quite stopped crying. The engine driver patted her on the back. "Here, cheer up, mate. It ain't so bad as all that here, I'll be bound." "I wanted," said Bobby, much cheered to find herself addressed as mate, "I only wanted to ask if you'd be so kind as to mend this." She picked up the brown paper parcel from among the coals and undid the string with hot red fingers that trembled. Her feet and legs felt the scorch of the engine fire, but her shoulders felt the wild, chill rush of the air. The engine lurched and shook and rattled, and as they shot under a bridge, the engine seemed to shout in her ears. The fireman shovelled on coals. Bobby unrolled the brown paper and disclosed the toy engine. "I thought that perhaps you'd mend this for me because you're an engineer, you know." The engine driver said he was blowed if he wasn't blessed. "I'm blessed if I ain't blowed," said the fireman. But the engine driver took the little engine and looked at it, and the fireman ceased for an instant to shovel coal and looked too. "It's like your precious cheek," said the engine driver. "Whatever made you think we'd be bothered tinkering penny toys?" "Oh, I didn't mean it for precious cheek. Only everybody that has anything to do with railways is so kind and good. I didn't think you'd mind. You don't really, do you?" For she'd seen a not unkindly wink pass between the two. "My trade's driving an engine, not mending her, especially such an outsize in engines as this here," said Bill. "And how are we going to get you back to your sorrowing friends and relations and all be forgiven and forgotten?" "If you'll put me down next time you stop," Bobby spoke firmly, though her heart beat fiercely against her arm as she clasped her hands, "and lend me the money for a third-class ticket, I'll pay you back honour bright. It's not a confidence trick, like in the newspapers, really, it's not." "You're a little lady every inch," said Bill. "We'll see you get home safe. And about this here engine. Jim, ain't you got ne'er a pal as can use a soldering iron? Seems to me that's about all the little bounder wants doing to it." "That's what Father said," Bobby exclaimed. "What's that for?" She pointed to a little brass wheel that he'd turned as he spoke. "That's the injector." "In what?" "Injector, to fill up the boiler." "Oh," said Bobby. Mentally she registered the fact to tell the others. "This here's the automatic brake." Bill was flattered by her enthusiasm. "You just move this here little handle, do it with one finger you can, and the train jolly soon stops. That's what they call the power of science in the newspapers. He showed her 2 little dials, like clock faces, and told her how one showed how much steam was going and the other showed if the brake was working properly. By the time she'd seen him shut off steam with a big shining steel handle, Bobby knew more about the inside working of an engine than she had ever thought there was to know. And Jim had promised that his second cousin's wife's brother should solder the toy engine, or Jim would know the reason why. Besides all the knowledge she'd gained, Bobby felt that she and Bill and Jim were now friends for life, and that they had wholly and forever forgiven her for stumbling uninvited among the sacred coals of their tender. At Stacklepool Junction she parted from them with warm expressions of mutual regard. They handed her over to the guard of a returning train, a friend of theirs, and she had the joy of knowing what guards do in their secret fastnesses, and understood how, when you pull the communication cord in railway carriages, a wheel goes round under the guard's nose and a loud bell rings in his ears. She asked the guard why his van smelt so fishy, and learnt that he had to carry a lot of fish every day, and that the wetness in the hollows of the corrugated floor had all drained out of boxes full of plaice and cod and mackerel and soles and smelts. Bobby got home in time for tea, and she felt as though her mind would burst with all that had been put into it since she parted from the others. How she blessed the nail that had torn her frock. "Where have you been?" asked the others. "To the station, of course," said Roberta. But she would not tell a word of her adventures till the day appointed, when she mysteriously led them to the station at the hour of 3:19's transit, and proudly introduced them to her friends Bill and Jim. Jim's second cousin's wife's brother had not been unworthy of the sacred trust imposed in him. The toy engine was literally as good as new. "Goodbye, oh goodbye," said Bobby, just before the engine screamed its goodbye. "I shall always, always love you, and Jim's second cousin's wife's brother as well." And as the 3 children went home up the hill, Peter hugging the engine, now quite its old self again, Bobby told with joyous leaps of the heart the story of how she had been an engine burglar. It was July. Perks had given the children some of the first strawberries from his garden. They'd enjoyed them so much that it gave them the idea of picking wild cherries. They'd seen the blossom on the trees in the spring, and they knew where to look for wild cherries now that cherry time was here. The trees grew all up and along the rocky face of the cliff out of which the mouth of the tunnel opened. There were all sorts of trees there, birches and beeches and baby oaks and hazels, and among them the cherry blossom. It had shone like snow and silver. The mouth of the tunnel was some way from 3 Chimneys, so Mother let them take their lunch with them in a basket. And the basket would do to bring the cherries back in, if they found any. She also lent them her silver watch, so that they should not be late for tea. Peter's watch had taken it into its head not to go since the day when Peter dropped it in the water butt. And they started. When they got to the top of the cutting, they leaned over the fence and looked down to where the railway lines lay at the bottom of what, as Phyllis said, was exactly like a mountain gorge. If it wasn't for the railway at the bottom, it would be as though the foot of man had never been there, wouldn't it? The sides of the cutting were of grey stone, very roughly hewn. Among the rocks, grass and flowers grew, and seeds dropped by birds in the crannies of the stone had taken root and grown into bushes and trees that overhung the cutting. Near the tunnel was a flight of steps leading down to the line, just wooden bars roughly fixed into the earth. A very steep and narrow way, more like a ladder than a stair. "We'd better go down," said Peter. "I'm sure the cherries would be quite easy to get at from the side of the steps." So they went along the fence towards the little swing gate that is at the top of these steps, and they were almost at the gate when Bobby said, "Shh, stop! What's that?" That was a very odd noise indeed. A soft noise, but quite plainly to be heard through the sound of the wind in the branches and the hum and the whir of the telegraph wires. It was a sort of rustling, whispering sound. As they listened, it stopped, and then it began again, and this time it did not stop, but it grew louder and more rustling and rumbling. "Look!" cried Peter suddenly, "the tree over there." The tree was moving, not just the way trees ought to move when the wind blows through them, but all in one piece, as though it were a live creature and were walking down the side of the cutting. "It's moving!" cried Bobby. "Oh, look, and so are the others. It's like the woods in Macbeth." "It's magic," said Phyllis. "I always knew the railway was enchanted." It really did seem a little like magic, for all the trees for about 20 yards at the opposite bank seemed to be slowly walking down towards the railway line. "What is it, or what is it?" said Phyllis. "It's much too magic for me. I don't like it. Let's go home." But Bobby and Peter clung fast to the rail and watched breathlessly, and Phyllis made no movement towards going home by herself. The trees moved on and on. Some stones and loose earth fell down and rattled on the railway metals far below. "It's all coming down," Peter tried to say, but just as he spoke, the great rock on the top of which the walking trees were leaned slowly forward, and then rock and trees and grass and bushes, with a rushing sound, slipped right away from the face of the cutting and fell on the line with a blundering crash that could have been heard half a mile off. A cloud of dust rose up. "Oh," said Peter. "Look what a great mound it's made," said Bobby. "Yes, it's right across the down line," said Phyllis. "That'll take some sweeping up." "Yes," said Peter. He was still leaning on the fence, and then he stood upright. "The 11:29 down hasn't gone by yet. We must let them know at the station, or there'll be the most frightful accident." "Let's run," said Bobby, and began. But Peter cried, "Come back," and looked at Mother's watch. He was very prompt and businesslike, and his face looked whiter than they'd ever seen it. "No time! It's 10 miles away, and it's past 11. "Couldn't we," suggested Phyllis, "couldn't we climb up a telegraph post and do something to the wires?" "We don't know how," said Peter. "They do it in war," said Phyllis. "I know, I've heard of it." "They only cut them, silly," said Peter, "and that doesn't do any good. Now, if we had anything red, we could go down on the line and wave it. But the train wouldn't see us till it got round the corner, and then it could see the mound just as well as us," said Phyllis. "Better, because it's much bigger than us." "If only we had something red," Peter repeated. "We could go round the corner and wave to the train. We might wave anyway. They'd only think it was just us, as usual. We've waved so often before. Anyway, let's go down." They got down the steep stairs. Bobby was pale and shivering. Peter's face looked thinner than usual. Phyllis was red-faced and damp with anxiety. "Oh, how hot I am," she said, "and I thought it was going to be cold. I wish we hadn't put on our flannel petticoats." "Oh, yes," cried Bobby. "They're red. Let's take them off." They did, and with the petticoats rolled up under their arms, ran along the railway, skirting the newly fallen mound of stones and rock and earth and bent, crushed, twisted trees. Peter led, but the girls were not far behind. They reached the corner that hid the mound from the straight line of railway that ran half a mile without curve or corner. "Now," said Peter, taking hold of the largest flannel petticoat. "You're not," Phyllis faltered. "You're not going to tear them?" "Shut up," said Peter. "Oh, yes," said Bobby. "Tear them into little bits if you like. Don't you see, Phil, if we can't stop the train, there'll be a real live accident with people killed. Oh, horrible. Here, Peter, you'll never tear it through the band." She took the red flannel petticoat from him and tore it off an inch from the band. Then she tore the other in the same way. "There," said Peter, tearing in his turn. He divided each petticoat into 3 pieces. "Now we've got 6 flags." He looked at the watch again. "And we've got 7 minutes. We must have flag staffs." The knives given to boys are, for some odd reason, seldom of the kind of steel that keeps sharp. The young saplings had to be broken off. 2 came up by the roots. The leaves were stripped from them. "We must cut holes in the flags and run the sticks through the holes," said Peter. And the holes were cut. The knife was sharp enough to cut flannel with. 2 of the flags were set up in heaps of loose stones beneath the sleepers of the down line. Then Phyllis and Roberta took each a flag and stood ready to wave it as soon as the train came in sight. "I shall have the other 2 myself," said Peter, "because it was my idea to wave something red." "There are petticoats, though," Phyllis was beginning, but Bobby interrupted. "Oh, what does it matter who waves what if we can only save the train?" Perhaps Peter had not rightly calculated the number of minutes it would take the 11:29 to get from the station to the place where they were, or perhaps the train was late. Anyway, it seemed a very long time that they waited. Phyllis grew impatient. "I expect the watch is wrong and the train's gone by." Peter relaxed the heroic attitude he'd chosen to show off his 2 flags, and Bobby began to feel sick with suspense. It seemed to her that they'd been standing there for hours and hours holding those silly little red flannel flags that no one would ever notice. The train wouldn't care. It would go rushing by them and tear round the corner and go crashing into that awful mound, and everyone would be killed. Her hands grew very cold and trembled so that she could hardly hold the flag. And then came the distant rumble and hum of the metals, and a puff of white steam showed far away along the stretch of line. "Stand firm," said Peter, "and wave like mad. When it gets to that big furze bush, step back, but go on waving. Don't stand on the line, Bobby." The train came rattling along very, very fast. "They don't see us. They won't see us. It's all no good," cried Bobby. The two little flags on the line swayed as the nearing train shook and loosened the heaps of loose stones that held them up. One of them slowly leaned over and fell on the line. Bobby jumped forward and caught it up and waved it. Her hands did not tremble now. It seemed that the train came on as fast as ever. It was very near now. "Keep off the line, you silly cuckoo," said Peter. "It's no good," Bobby said again. "Stand back," cried Peter suddenly, and he dragged Phyllis back by the arm. But Bobby cried, "Not yet, not yet," and waved her flags right over the line. The front of the engine looked black and enormous. Its voice was loud and harsh. "Oh, stop, stop, stop," cried Bobby. No one heard her. At least Peter and Phyllis didn't, for the oncoming rush of the train covered her voice with a mountain of sound. But afterwards she used to wonder whether the engine itself had not heard her, for it slackened swiftly, slackened and stopped, not 20 yards from the place where Bobby's two flags waved over the line. She saw the great black engine stop dead, but somehow she could not stop waving the flags. And when the driver and the fireman had got off the engine, and Peter and Phyllis had gone to meet them and pour out their excited tale of the awful mound just round the corner, Bobby still waved the flags, but more and more feebly and jerkily. When the others turned towards her, she was lying across the line, with her hands flung forward and still gripping the sticks of the little red flannel flags. The engine driver picked her up, carried her to the train, and laid her on the cushions of a first-class carriage. "Gone right off in a faint," he said, "poor little woman, and no wonder. I'll just have a look at this here mound of yours, and then we'll run you back to the station and get her seen to." It was horrible to see Bobby lying so white and quiet, with her lips blue and parted. "I believe that's what people look like when they're dead," whispered Phyllis. "Don't," said Peter. They sat by Bobby on the blue cushions, and the train ran back. Before it reached their station, Bobby sighed and opened her eyes, and rolled herself over and began to cry. This cheered the others wonderfully. They'd seen her cry before, but they'd never seen her faint, nor anyone else for that matter. They had not known what to do when she was fainting, but now she was only crying, they could thump her on the back and tell her not to, just as they always did. And presently, when she stopped crying, they were able to laugh at her for being such a coward as to faint. When the station was reached, the three were the heroes of an agitated meeting on the platform. The praises they got for their prompt action, their common sense, their ingenuity, were enough to have turned anybody's head. Phyllis enjoyed herself thoroughly. She'd never been a real heroine before, and the feeling was delicious. Peter's ears got very red, yet he too enjoyed himself. Only Bobby wished they all wouldn't. She wanted to get away. "You'll hear from the company about this, I expect," said the stationmaster. Bobby wished she might never hear of it again. She pulled at Peter's jacket. "Oh, come away, I want to go home," she said. So they went. And as they went, stationmaster and porter and guards and driver and fireman and passengers sent up a cheer. "Oh, listen," cried Phyllis, "that's for us." "Yes," said Peter. "I say, I am glad I thought about something red and waving it." "How lucky we did put on our red flannel petticoats," said Phyllis. Bobby said nothing. She was thinking of the horrible mound and the trustful train rushing towards it. "It was us that saved them," said Peter. "It would have been dreadful if they'd all been killed," said Phyllis. "Wouldn't it, Bobby?" "We never got any cherries after all," said Bobby. The others thought her rather heartless. But she wasn't really heartless. For instance, she was quite oddly anxious to make other people happy, and she could keep a secret, a tolerably rare accomplishment. Also, she had the power of silent sympathy. That sounds rather dull, I know, but it's not so dull as it sounds. It just means that a person is able to know that you're unhappy and to love you extra on that account, without bothering you by telling you all the time how sorry she is for you. That was what Bobby was like. She knew that Mother was unhappy and that Mother had not told her the reason. So she just loved Mother more and never said a single word that could let Mother know how earnestly she wondered what Mother was unhappy about. All this needs practice. It's not so easy as you might think. Whatever happened, and all sorts of nice, pleasant, ordinary things happened, such as picnics, games, and buns for tea, Bobby always had these thoughts at the back of her mind. Mother's unhappy. Why? I don't know. She doesn't want me to know. I won't try to find out, but she is unhappy. Why? I don't know. She doesn't... And so on, repeating and repeating like a tune that you don't know the stopping part of. Bobby had another quality which you will hear differently described by different people. Some of them call it interfering in other people's business, and some call it helping lame dogs over stiles, and some call it loving kindness. It just means trying to help people. For many and many a night after the day when she and Peter and Phyllis had saved the train from wreck, Bobby used to wake screaming and shivering, seeing again that horrible mound and the poor dear trustful engine rushing on towards it, just thinking that it was doing its swift duty and that everything was clear and safe. And then a warm thrill of pleasure used to run through her at the remembrance of how she and Peter and Phyllis and the red flannel petticoats had really saved everybody. One morning a letter came. It was addressed to Peter and Bobby and Phyllis. They opened it with enthusiastic curiosity, for they did not often get letters. The letter said, "Dear Sir and Ladies, it is proposed to make a small presentation to you in commemoration of your prompt and courageous action in warning the train on the such-and-such instant, and thus averting what must, humanly speaking, have been a terrible accident. The presentation will take place at the station at 3 o'clock on the 30th inst, if this time and place will be convenient to you. Yours faithfully, Jabez Inglewood, Secretary, Great Northern and Southern Railway Company." There never had been a prouder moment in the lives of the three children. They rushed to Mother with the letter, and she also felt proud and said so, and this made the children happier than ever. "But if the presentation is money, you must say, 'Thank you, but we'd rather not take it,' said Mother. 'I'll wash your Indian muslins at once,' she added. 'You must look tidy on an occasion like this.' 'Phil and I can wash them,' said Bobby, 'if you'll iron them, Mother.' Washing is rather fun. I wonder whether you've ever done it. This particular washing took place in the back kitchen, which had a stone floor and a very big stone sink under its window. "It's a nice drying day, that's one thing," said Bobby, feeling very grown up. "Oh, I do wonder what wonderful feelings we shall have when we wear the Indian muslin dresses." "Yes, so do I," said Phyllis, shaking and squeezing the soapy water out of the muslin in quite a professional manner. "A presentation, that means presents," said Peter, as his sisters, having duly washed the pegs and wiped the line, hung up the dresses to dry. "Whatever will it be?" "It might be anything," said Phyllis. "What I've always wanted is a baby elephant, but I suppose they wouldn't know that." "Suppose it was gold models of steam engines," said Bobby. "Or a big model of the scene of the prevented accident," suggested Peter, "with a little model train, and dolls dressed like us, and the engine driver and fireman and passengers." "Do you like," said Bobby, drying her hands on the rough towel that hung on a roller at the back of the scullery door, "do you like us being rewarded for saving a train?" "Yes, I do," said Peter, "and don't you try to come it over as that you don't like it too, because I know you do." "Yes, I know I do, but oughtn't we to be satisfied with just having done it and not ask for anything more?" "Who did ask for anything more, silly? Victoria Cross soldiers don't ask for it, but they're glad enough to get it all the same. Perhaps it'll be medals, and then when I'm very old indeed, I shall show them to my grandchildren and say, 'We only did our duty,' and they'll be awfully proud of me." "You have to be married," warned Phyllis, "or you don't have any grandchildren." "I suppose I shall have to be married some day, but it will be an awful bother having her round all the time. I'd like to marry a lady who had trances and only woke up once or twice a year. Just to say you were the light of her life and then go to sleep again. Yes, that wouldn't be bad," said Bobby. "When I get married," said Phyllis, "I shall want him to want me to be awake all the time so that I can hear him say how nice I am." "I think it would be nice," said Bobby, "to marry someone very poor, and then you'd do all the work and he'd love you most frightfully, and see the blue wood smoke curling up among the trees from the domestic hearth as he came home from work every night. I say, we've got to answer that letter and say that the time and place will be convenient to us. There's the soap, Peter. We're both as clean as clean. That pink book of writing paper you had on your birthday, Phil. It took some time to arrange what should be said. Mother had gone back to her writing, and several sheets of pink paper were spoiled before the three had decided what to say. Then each made a copy and signed it with its own name. The threefold letter ran, "Dear Mr. Jabez Inglewood, thank you very much. We did not want to be rewarded, but only to save the train, but we are glad you think so, and thank you very much. The time and place you say will be quite convenient to us. Thank you very much. Your affectionate little friend." Then came the name, and after it, "P.S. Thank you very much." "Washing is much easier than ironing," said Bobby, taking the clean dresses off the line. "I do love to see things come clean. Oh, I don't know how we shall wait till it's time to know what presentation they're going to present." When at last, it seemed a very long time after, it was the day, the three children went down to the station at the proper time, and everything that happened was so odd that it seemed like a dream. The stationmaster came out to meet them in his best clothes, as Peter noticed at once, and led them into the waiting room. It looked quite different now. A carpet had been put down, there were pots of roses on the mantelpiece and on the window ledges. There were quite a number of people there besides the porter, 2 or 3 ladies in smart dresses, and quite a crowd of gentlemen in high hats and frock coats, besides everybody who belonged to the station. They recognized several people who'd been in the train on the red flannel petticoat day. Best of all, their own old gentleman was there, and his coat and hat and collar seemed more than ever different from anyone else's. He shook hands with them, and then everybody sat down on chairs, and a gentleman in spectacles, they found afterwards that he was the district superintendent, began quite a long speech which made the children blush and get hot about the ears. He said all sorts of nice things about their bravery and presence of mind, and when he sat down, everyone who was there clapped and said, "Hear, hear." And then the old gentleman got up and said things too. It was very like a prize-giving. And then he called the children one by their names and gave each of them a beautiful gold watch and chain. And inside the watches were engraved, after the name of the watch's new owner, "From the directors of the Northern and Southern Railway, in grateful recognition of the courageous and prompt action which averted an accident on," then the date, 1905. The watches were the most beautiful you can possibly imagine, and each one had a blue leather case to live in when it was at home. "You must make a speech now and thank everyone for their kindness," whispered the station-master in Peter's ear, and pushed him forward. "Begin, ladies and gentlemen," he added. Each of the children had already said thank you quite properly. "Oh, dear," said Peter, but he did not resist the push. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. Then there was a pause, and he heard his heart beating in his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's most awfully good of you, and we shall treasure the watches all our lives, but really we don't deserve it, because what we did wasn't anything really. At least, I mean, it was awfully exciting, and what I mean to say, well, thank you all very, very much." The people clapped Peter more than they had done the district superintendent, and then everyone shook hands with them, and as soon as politeness would let them, they got away and tore up the hill to Three Chimneys with their watches in their hands. It was a wonderful day, the kind of day that very seldom happens to anybody, and to most of us not at all. "I did want to talk to our old gentleman," said Bobby, "but it was so public, like being in church." "Fancy him being a direction of the railway," Phyllis said, "and we never knew." "A director, you mean," said Peter. "Anyway," said Bobby, "he must be horribly clever. I expect he knows just about everything." When they first went to live at Three Chimneys, the children had talked a great deal about their father, and had asked a great many questions about him, and what he was doing, and where he was, and when he would come home. Mother always answered their questions as well as she could, but as the time went on, they grew to speak less of him. Bobby had felt almost from the first that for some strange reason these questions hurt Mother and made her sad, and little by little the others came to have this feeling too, though they could not have put it into words. One day, when Mother was working so hard that she could not leave off even for 10 minutes, Bobby carried up her tea to the big bare room that they called Mother's workshop. It had hardly any furniture, just a table and a chair and a rug, but always big pots of flowers on the windowsills and on the mantelpiece. The children saw to that. And from the 3 long, uncurtained windows, the beautiful stretch of meadow and moorland, the far violet of the hills and the unchanging changefulness of cloud and sky. "Here's your tea, Mother, love," said Bobby. "Do drink it while it's hot." Mother laid down her pen among the pages that were scattered all over the table, pages covered with her writing, which was almost as plain as print and much prettier. She ran her hands into her hair as if she was going to pull it out by handfuls. "Poor, poor head," said Bobby. "Does it ache?" "No, yes, well, not much," said Mother. "Bobby, do you think Peter and Phil are forgetting Father?" "No, why?" "You none of you ever speak of him now." Bobby stood first on one leg and then on the other. "We often talk about him when we're by ourselves, but not to me. Why?" Bobby did not find it easy to say why. She stopped, went over to the window and looked out. "Bobby, come here." "Now," said Mother, putting her arm round Bobby and laying her ruffled head against Bobby's shoulder. "Try to tell me, dear. Tell Mother." "Well, I thought you were so unhappy about Daddy not being here it made you worse when I talked about him, so I stopped doing it." "And the others?" "I don't know about the others. I never said anything about that to them, but I expect they felt about it the same as me." "Bobby, dear," said Mother, still leaning her head against her, "I'll tell you. Besides parting from Father, he and I have had a great sorrow, oh, terrible, worse than anything you can think of. And at first it did hurt to hear you all talking of him as if everything were just the same. But it would be much more terrible if you were to forget him. That would be worse than anything." "The trouble," said Bobby, "I promised I would never ask you any questions, and I never have I? But the trouble, it won't last always." "No. The worst will be over when Father comes home to us." "I wish I could comfort you." "Oh, my dear, do you suppose you don't? What should I do without you, you and the others? Do you think I haven't noticed how good you've all been? Not quarreling nearly as much as you used to, and all the little kind things you do for me. The flowers, and cleaning my shoes, and tearing up to make my bed before I get time to do it myself." Bobby had wondered sometimes whether Mother noticed these things. "That's nothing to what—" "I must get on with my work," said Mother, giving Bobby one last squeeze. "Don't say anything to the others." When Bobby came to think it all over, she tried not to wonder what the great trouble was, but she could not always help it. Father was not dead, Mother had said so, and he was not ill, or Mother would have been with him. Being poor wasn't the trouble. Bobby knew it was something nearer the heart than money could be. "I mustn't try to think what it is," she told herself. "No, I mustn't. I'm glad Mother noticed about us not quarreling so much. We'll keep that up." But alas, that very afternoon she and Peter had what Peter called a first-class shindy. They'd not been a week at Three Chimneys before they'd asked Mother to let them have a piece of garden each for their very own, and she'd agreed. And the south border, under the peach trees, had been divided into 3 pieces, and they were allowed to plant whatever they liked there. Phyllis had planted mignonette and nasturtium and Virginia stock in hers. The seeds came up, and though they looked just like weeds, Phyllis believed that they would bear flowers some day. The Virginia stock justified her faith quite soon, and her garden was gay with a band of bright little flowers, pink and white and red and mauve. "I can't weed for fear I pull up the wrong things," she used to say comfortably. "It saves such a lot of work." Peter sowed vegetable seeds in his, carrots and onions and turnips. The seed was given to him by the farmer who lived in the nice black and white wood and plaster house just beyond the bridge. He kept turkeys and guinea fowls and was a most amiable man. But Peter's vegetables never had much of a chance because he liked to use the earth of his garden for digging canals and making forts and earthworks for his toy soldiers. And the seeds of vegetables rarely came to much in a soil that is constantly disturbed for the purposes of war and irrigation. Bobby planted rose bushes in her garden, but all the little new leaves of the rose bushes shriveled and withered, because perhaps she moved them from the other part of the garden in May, which is not at all the right time of the year for moving roses. But she would not own that they were dead, and hoped on against hope until the day when Perks came up to see the garden and told her quite plainly that all her roses were as dead as doornails. "Only good for bonfires, miss," he said. "You just dig 'em up and burn them, and I'll give you some nice fresh roots out of my garden. Pansies and stocks and sweet willies and forget-me-nots. I'll bring 'em along tomorrow if you get the ground ready." So next day she set to work, and that happened to be the day when Mother had praised her and the others about not quarrelling. She moved the rose bushes and carried them to the other end of the garden, where the rubbish heap was that they meant to make a bonfire of when Guy Fawkes Day came. Meanwhile, Peter had decided to flatten out all his forts and earthworks with a view to making a model of the railway tunnel, cutting, embankment, canal, aqueduct, bridges, and all. So when Bobby came back from her last thorny journey with the dead rose bushes, he'd got the rake and was using it busily. "I was using the rake," said Bobby. "Well, I'm using it now," said Peter. "But I had it first. Then it's my turn now." And that was how the quarrel began. "You're always being disagreeable about nothing," said Peter, after some heated argument. "I had the rake first," said Bobby, flushed and defiant and holding on to its handle. "Didn't I tell you this morning I meant to have it? Didn't I, Phil?" Phyllis said she didn't want to be mixed up in their rows, and instantly, of course, she was. "If you remember, you ought to say." Of course she doesn't remember, but she might say so. "I wish I had a brother instead of two whiny kiddie sisters," said Peter. Bobby made the reply she always made to that. "I can't think why little boys were ever invented." And just as she said it, she looked up and saw the 3 long windows of Mother's workshop flashing in the red rays of the sun. The sight brought back those words of praise. "You don't quarrel like you used to do." "Oh," cried Bobby. She wanted to say, "Don't let's quarrel, Mother hates it so," but though she tried hard, she couldn't. "Take the rake, then," was the best she could manage. And she suddenly let go her hold on the handle. Peter staggered and fell over backwards, the teeth of the rake between his feet. He lay still for half a moment, and then began to shriek, faintly but steadily. It sounded exactly like a pig being killed a quarter of a mile off. Mother put her head out of the window, and it wasn't half a minute after that she was in the garden, kneeling by his side. "What happened, Bobby?" "It was the rake," said Phyllis. "Peter was pulling at it, so was Bobby, and she let go, and he went over." "Stop that noise, Peter. Come, stop at once." Peter used up what breath he had left in a last squeal and stopped. "Now, are you hurt?" "If he was really hurt, he wouldn't make such a fuss," said Bobby. "He's not a coward." "I think my foot's broken off, that's all," said Peter, and sat up. Then he turned quite white. Mother put her arm around him. "He is hurt. He's fainted. Here, Bobby, sit down and take his head on your lap." Then Mother undid Peter's boots. As she took the right one off, something dripped from his foot onto the ground. It was red blood. And when the stocking came off, there were 3 red wounds in Peter's foot and ankle where the teeth of the rake had bitten him, and his foot was covered with red smears. Phyllis ran for the doctor, and Mother and Bobby carried Peter in and laid him on the brown wooden settle in the dining room. Mother sat by him and bathed his foot and talked to him, and Bobby went out and got tea ready and put on the kettle. "Oh, it's all I can do," she told herself. "Suppose Peter should die, or be a helpless cripple for life, or have to walk with crutches, or wear a boot with a sole like a log of wood." She stood by the back door reflecting on these gloomy possibilities, her eyes fixed on the water butt. "I wish I'd never been born," she said it out loud. "Why, lawk-a-mercy, what's that for?" Perks stood before her, with a wooden trug basket full of green-leaved things and soft loose earth. "Oh, it's you. Peter's hurt his foot with a rake, 3 great gaping wounds like soldiers get, and it was partly my fault." "That it wasn't, I'll be bound. Doctor seen him?" "Phyllis has gone for the doctor." "He'll be all right, you see if he isn't. Why, my father's second cousin had a hay-fork run into him, right into his inside, and he was right as ever in a few weeks. All except his being a bit weak in the head afterwards, and they did say it was along of his getting a touch of the sun in the hayfield, and not the fork at all. I remember him well. A kind-hearted chap, but soft, as you might say." Bobby tried to let herself be cheered by this heartening reminiscence. "Well, you won't want to be bothered with gardening just this minute, I dare say. You show me where your garden is, and I'll pop the bits of stuff in for you. And I'll hang about, if I may make so free, to see the doctor as he comes out and hear what he says. You cheer up, missy. I'll lay a pound he ain't hurt, not to speak of. But he was. The doctor came and looked at the foot and bandaged it beautifully and said that Peter must not put it to the ground for at least a week. "He won't be lame or have to wear crutches or a lump on his foot, will he?" whispered Bobby at the door. "My aunt, no. He'll be as nimble as ever on his pins in a fortnight. Don't you worry, little Mother Goose." It was when Mother had gone to the gate with the doctor to take his last instructions, and Phyllis was filling the kettle for tea, that Peter and Bobby found themselves alone. "He said you won't be lame or anything," said Bobby. "Of course I shan't, silly." Peter was very much relieved all the same. "Oh, Peter, I am so sorry." "That's all right. It was all my fault." "Rot." "If we hadn't quarrelled, it wouldn't have happened. I knew it was wrong to quarrel. I wanted to say so, but somehow I couldn't." "Don't drivel. I shouldn't have stopped if you had said it. Not likely. Besides, us rowing has nothing to do with it. I might have caught my foot in the hoe, or taken off my fingers in the chaff-cutting machine, or blown my nose off with fireworks. It would have been hurt just the same whether we'd been rowing or not. But I knew it was wrong to quarrel." Bobby was in tears. "And now you're hurt, and... Now look here, you just dry up. If you're not careful, you'll turn into a beastly little Sunday school prig, so I tell you." "Oh, I don't mean to be a prig, but it's so hard not to be when you're really trying to be good." The gentle reader may perhaps have suffered from this difficulty. "Not it. It's a jolly good thing it wasn't you was hurt. I'm glad it was me. There. If it had been you, you'd have been lying on the sofa looking like a suffering angel and being the light of the anxious household and all that, and I couldn't have stood it." "No, I shouldn't." "Yes, you would. I tell you I shouldn't. I tell you you would." "Oh, children," said Mother's voice at the door. "Quarrelling again, already." "We aren't quarrelling, not really," said Peter. "I wish you wouldn't think it's rows every time we don't agree." When Mother had gone out again, Bobby broke out, "Peter, I am sorry you're hurt, but you are a beast to say I'm a prig." "Well, perhaps I am. You did say I wasn't a coward even when you were in such a wax. The only thing is, don't you be a prig, that's all. You keep your eyes open, and if you feel priggishness coming on, just stop in time, see?" "Yes, I see." "Then let's call it Pax. Bury the hatchet in the fathoms of the past. Shake hands on it. I say, Bobby, old chap, I am tired." He was tired for many days after that, and the settle seemed hard and uncomfortable in spite of all the pillows and bolsters and soft folded rugs. It was terrible not to be able to go out. They moved the settle to the window, and from there Peter could see the smoke of the trains winding along the valley, but he could not see the trains. At first Bobby found it quite hard to be as nice to him as she wanted to be, for fear he should think her priggish. But that soon wore off, and both she and Phyllis were, as he observed, jolly good sorts. Mother sat with him when the sisters were out, and the words, "He's not a coward," made Peter determined not to make any fuss about the pain in his foot, though it was rather bad, especially at night. Praise helps people very much sometimes. There were visitors, too. Mrs. Perks came up to ask how he was, and so did the stationmaster and several of the village people. But the time went slowly, slowly. "Oh, I do wish there was something to read," said Peter. "I've read all our books about 50 times over." "I'll go to the doctor's," said Phyllis. "He's sure to have some." "Only about how to be ill and about people's nasty insides, I expect." "Perks has a whole heap of magazines that come out of trains when people are tired of them," said Bobby. "I'll run down and ask him." So the girls went their two ways. Bobby found Perks busy cleaning lamps. "And how's the young gent?" "Oh, better, thanks, but he's most frightfully bored. I came to ask if you've got any magazines you could lend him." "There now," Perks regretfully rubbed his ear with a black and oily lump of cotton waste. "Why didn't I think of that now? I was trying to think of something as'd amuse him only this morning, and I couldn't think of anything better than a guinea pig. And a young chap I know's going to fetch that over for him this tea time. Oh, how lovely! A real live guinea pig. He will be pleased. But he'd like the magazines as well." "That's just it. I've just sent the pick of 'em to Snigson's boy, him what's just getting over the pneumonia. But I've lots of illustrated papers left." He turned to the pile of papers in the corner and took up a heap 6 inches thick. "There, I'll just slip a bit of string and a bit of paper round 'em." He pulled an old newspaper from the pile and spread it on the table and made a neat parcel of it. There's lots of pictures, and if he likes to mess about with his paint box or coloured chalks or whatnot, why, let him. I don't want 'em. You're a dear, said Bobby, took the parcel and started. The papers were heavy, and when she had to wait at the level crossing while a train went by, she rested the parcel on the top of the gate. And idly she looked at the printing on the paper that the parcel was wrapped in. It seemed like some horrible dream. She read on. The bottom of the column was torn off. She could read no further. She never remembered how she got home, but she went on tiptoe to her room and locked the door. Then she undid the parcel and read that printed column again. So now I know, she said. What she had read was headed, End of the trial, verdict, sentence. The man who had been tried was her father, the verdict was guilty, and the sentence was 5 years penal servitude. Oh, Daddy! She crushed the paper hard. It's not true. I don't believe it. You never did it. Never, never, never. There was a hammering at the door. Bobby hastily pushed the paper under her mattress and said, What is it? It's me, said the voice of Phyllis. Tea's ready, and a boy's brought Peter a guinea pig. Come along down. And Bobby had to. She had to go down to tea and pretend that there was nothing the matter. The pretense was very bravely made, but it wasn't very successful. Her pale face had red tear blotches on it. My darling, cried Mother, whatever is the matter? My head aches, rather, said Bobby, and indeed it did. It was not a cheerful meal. When at last Mother took out the tray, Bobby followed her. She's gone to own up, said Phyllis to Peter. I wonder what she's done. Broken something, I suppose, said Peter. Bobby in the kitchen had caught hold of Mother's hand. What is it? But Bobby only said, Come upstairs. Come up where nobody can hear us. When she'd got Mother alone in her room, she pulled out the paper she'd hidden under her mattress and held it out. Oh, Bobby, Mother cried. You don't believe it. You don't believe Daddy did it. No. That's all right. It's not true, and they've shut him up in prison, but he's done nothing wrong. Oh, Daddy, why didn't you tell me, Mummy? Are you going to tell the others? No. Why? Because... Exactly. So you understand why I didn't tell you. We two must help each other to be brave. And now, sitting cuddled up close to her mother, Bobby heard all about it. She heard how those men who had asked to see Father on that last night when the engine was being mended had come to arrest him, charging him with selling state secrets to the Russians, with being, in fact, a spy and a traitor. She heard about the trial and about the evidence. Letters found in Father's desk at the office, letters that convinced the jury that Father was guilty. Oh, how could they look at him and believe it, cried Bobby, and how could anyone do such a thing? Someone did it, said Mother, and all the evidence was against Father. Those letters, yes. How did those letters get into his desk? Someone must have put them there, said Mother, and the person who put them there was the person who was really guilty. Couldn't we explain that to someone? Nobody will listen. Do you suppose that I've not tried everything? No, my dearest, there's nothing to be done. All we can do, you and I, and Daddy, is to be brave and patient, and to pray, Bobby dear. The other two were very gentle and kind to Bobby, and they did not ask her what was the matter. This was Peter's idea. Phyllis would have asked 100 questions if she'd been left to herself. A week later, Bobby managed to get away alone, and once more she wrote a letter, and once more it was to the old gentleman. My dear friend, she said, you see what is in this paper. It is not true. Father never did it. Mother says someone put the papers in Father's desk. But nobody listens to a word she says, but you're so good and clever. Can't you find out who did the treason? Because it wasn't Father, upon my honour. He's an English gentleman and incapable to do such things. And then they would let Father out of prison. Oh, do help me. I'll pray for you twice every day as long as I live if you'll only try to find out. Think if it was your Daddy what you would feel. With love, I remain your affectionately little friend, Roberta. P.S. Mother would send her kind regards if she knew I'm writing, but it's no use telling her I am in case you can't do anything. She cut the account of her father's trial out of the newspaper and put it in the envelope with her letter. Then she took it to the station and gave it to the stationmaster to give to the old gentleman next morning. Several days later, soon after breakfast, there came a knock at the front door. The children were hard at work cleaning the brass candlesticks. "Whoever can that be?" said Mother. "I'll go. Shut the kitchen door. You're not fit to be seen." They could hear a man's voice, then the sound of Mother showing the visitor, whoever he was, into the dining room. Everyone was certain they'd heard that voice before. Then there was a longish pause. "Who can it possibly be?" they kept on asking. Then Mother came into the kitchen. "A gentleman is here. Wash your hands and faces, and then you can see him. He wants to see you." The door shut again. "There now," said Peter. "Let's have some hot water, Mrs. Viney. I'm as black as your hat." The three were indeed dirty, for the stuff you clean brass candlesticks with is very far from cleaning to the cleaner. When they'd finished with the soap and flannel, though still damp because it takes such a long time to dry your hands properly, they filed into the dining room. Mother was sitting in the window seat, and in the leather-covered armchair that Father always used to sit in at the other house sat their own old gentleman. "Well, I never did," said Peter. "It's our own old gentleman," said Phyllis. "Oh, it's you," said Bobby. And then they remembered themselves and their manners and said, "How do you do?" very nicely. "I wanted to have a little talk with your mother," said the old gentleman. "I thought it was time I paid my respects, and she's been kind enough to forgive me for calling so early and without warning. But, dear me," he said, looking at his watch, "I must go at once if I'm to catch the next train on to London." The old gentleman rose. "Take care of your mother, my dears. She's a woman in a million." "Yes, isn't she?" whispered Bobby. "God bless her." The old gentleman took both Mother's hands. "God bless her. Aye, and she shall be blessed. Dear me, where's my hat? Will Bobby come with me to the gate?" At the gate he stopped and said, "You're a good child, my dear. I got your letter, but it wasn't needed. When I read about your father's case in the papers at the time, I had my doubts. And ever since I've known who you were, I've been trying to find out things. I haven't done very much yet, but I have hopes, my dear, I have hopes." "Oh," said Bobby. "Yes, I may say great hopes. But keep your secret a little longer. Wouldn't do to upset your mother with a false hope, would it?" "Oh, but it isn't false. I know you can do it. I knew you could when I wrote. It isn't a false hope, is it?" "No, I don't think it is a false hope, or I wouldn't have told you. And I think you deserve to be told that there is a hope. But you don't think Father did it, do you? Oh, say you don't think he did." "My dear, I'm perfectly certain he didn't." If it was a false hope, it was none the less a very radiant one that lay warm at Bobby's heart, and through the days that followed, lighted her face as a Japanese lantern is lighted by the candle within. It was September now, and the turf on the slope to the railway was dry and crisp. Little long grass spikes stood up like bits of gold wire, and the golden stars of St. John's Wort shone at the edges of the pool that lay halfway to the railway. "Hurry up," said Peter, "or we shall miss the 9:15. "I can't hurry more than I'm doing," said Phyllis. "Oh, bother it, my bootlace has come undone again." "When you're married," said Peter, "your bootlace will come undone going up the church aisle, and your man that you're going to get married to will tumble over it and smash his nose in on the ornamented pavement. And then you'll say you won't marry him and you'll have to be an old maid." "I shan't," said Phyllis. "I'd much rather marry a man with his nose smashed in than not marry anybody." "Look, the signal's down," cried Bobby. "We must run." They ran, and once more they waved their handkerchiefs to the 9:15. "Take our love to Father," cried Bobby, and the others too shouted, "Take our love to Father." The old gentleman waved from his first-class carriage window. There was nothing odd in that, for he always had waved. But what was really remarkable was that from every window handkerchiefs fluttered, newspapers signalled, hands waved wildly, and the children were left looking at each other. "What on earth does that mean?" asked Peter, but he didn't expect any answer. "I don't know," said Bobby. "Perhaps the old gentleman told the people at his station to look out for us and wave. He knew that we should like it." Now, curiously enough, this was just what had happened. The old gentleman had got to the station early this morning and had said something to every single passenger waiting on the platform. And when the passengers got into the train, they had told the other passengers who were already there what the old gentleman had said. "It is most extraordinarily rum," said Peter. "Most extraordinary," echoed Phyllis. But Bobby said, "Don't you think the old gentleman's wave seemed more significating than usual? I feel just exactly as if something was going to happen." "What is going to happen," said Peter, "is that Phyllis's stocking is going to come down." This was too true. The suspender had given way. Bobby's handkerchief served as first aid, and they all went home. Lessons were more than usually difficult to Bobby that day. "Mother, will you let me off lessons? I feel as if I wanted to be quite alone by myself." "Yes, of course," said Mother. "You don't feel ill, do you?" "No, but I'd be more alive in the garden, I think." But she could not stay in the garden. It was one of those still, shiny autumn days when everything does seem to be waiting. Bobby couldn't wait. "I'll go down to the station," she said, "and talk to Perks." So she went down. On the way, she passed the old lady from the post office, who gave her a kiss and a hug, but no words except, "God bless you, love, run along, do." The draper's boy, who had sometimes been a little less than civil, uttered the remarkable words, "Morning, miss, I'm sure." The blacksmith, coming along with an open newspaper in his hand, said, in answer to her good morning, "Good morning to you, missy, and many of them. I wish you joy, that I do." "Oh," said Bobby to herself, "something is going to happen. I know it is. Everyone's so odd, like people are in dreams." The stationmaster wrung her hand warmly, but he only said, "The 11:54's a bit late, miss. The extra luggage this holiday time," and went away very quickly into that inner temple of his. Perks was not to be seen, but the station cat came out to rub herself against the brown stockings of Bobby with reverberating purrs. "Dear me," said Bobby, "how very kind everybody is today, even you, pussy." Perks did not appear until the 11:54 was signalled, and then he, like everybody else that morning, had a newspaper in his hand. "Hello," he said, "here you are. Well, if this is the train, it'll be smart work. Well, God bless you, my dear. I see it in the paper, and I didn't think I was ever so glad of anything in all me born days." "Saw what in the paper?" asked Bobby. But already the 11:54 was steaming into the station, and the station-master was looking at all the places where Perks was not, and ought to have been. Bobby was left standing alone, the station cat watching her from under the bench with friendly golden eyes. Of course you know already exactly what was going to happen. Bobby was not so clever. What her heart expected, I can't tell, but her mind expected nothing. It was almost blank. Only 3 people got out of the 11:54. The first was a countrywoman with 2 boxes of live chickens. The second was Miss Peckett, the grocer's wife's cousin. And the third... "Oh, my daddy, my daddy!" That scream went like a knife into the heart of everyone in the train, and people put their heads out of the windows to see a tall, pale man and a little girl clinging to him with arms and legs, while his arms went tightly round her. "I knew something wonderful was going to happen," said Bobby, as they went up the road, "but I didn't think it was going to be this. Oh, my daddy, my daddy." "Then didn't Mother get my letter?" "There weren't any letters this morning. Oh, Daddy." "You must go in by yourself, Bobby, and tell Mother quite quietly that it's all right. They've caught the man who did it. Everyone knows now that it wasn't your daddy." "I always knew it wasn't," said Bobby. "Me and Mother and our old gentleman." "Yes, it's all his doing. Mother wrote and told me you'd found out, and she told me what you'd been to her." And now I see them crossing the field. Bobby goes into the house to tell Mother quite quietly that the sorrow and the struggle and the parting are over and done, and that Father has come home. I see Father walking in the garden, waiting. The door opens. Bobby's voice calls, "Come in, Daddy, come in." He goes in, and the door is shut. I think it will be best for us to go quickly and quietly away. At the end of the field, we may just take one last look, over our shoulders, at the White House where neither we nor anyone else is needed for a while.